today and welcome to the fifth session in the Gerhard Center webinar series. First of all, let me welcome our very special guest speaker today, who's joining the call from Johannesburg, Jenny Hodgson. Hello, Jenny.
Hi, Karaman. Hi, nice to be here. Hello, everybody.
Thank you so much for making the time and accepting our invitation to lead today's discussion around the role of community philanthropy to build from the bottom up. We really appreciate you. Jenny is the executive director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Actually, I first met her 2 years ago in the African Philanthropy Forum. We were connected through the Ford Foundation, and I got the chance to have a quick chat with her around the work of the Global Fund for Community Foundation. And to be honest, I was so much impressed by their unconventional approach in supporting local development through community foundations, through community philanthropy. What's really unique about what they do is the way they challenge the mainstream approach of local development. What they do, they actually challenge the mainstream approach of the big donor parachuting a community and making decisions on behalf of the members of the community on matters related to their local development agenda, ignoring the local context and the culture, things like that. But what those folks do is that they focus on mobilizing the resources of communities, already existent resources of communities. So we do this through working with local partners by small grants and other non-financial support. And thus they manage to contribute in shifting the power of decision making on resource allocation to the bottom, to the people, which is not the norm, at least in our context. This is not how things go. So Jenny, before we start, if you can talk a bit about the concept of community philanthropy and how effective is it in promoting bottom-up approach in development, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Karaman. Well, it's part of my presentation, so shall I just jump into that? Yes. I'll share my screen. Will you tell me if you can see it? Okay, should be all getting quick at this.
Okay, we can see it now.
You can see it, great. Thank you so much, Karaman, and hello everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I realize seeing myself on the screen, I have quite a busy background, so if I get dull, you feel free to look around our slightly chaotic study here in Johannesburg. So I'm joining you here today. I'm from Johannesburg, where I'm based. I've been based here for the last nearly 12 years, although I'm originally from the UK, which I also left many years ago, back in 1992. We are in week of lockdown. I'm sure many of you relate to this ongoing feeling of never leaving your house again. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. And in fact, the topic of these webinars is something that's been very much on my mind for the last few weeks as we've tried to work out what our response is, both immediately to COVID-19, but also this idea of how we start to think forward and about building back better. So this is what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. I've got a few slides to share, and then I really hope we can get up into a discussion. So I'm going to talk about the world pre-COVID-19, and I think, Karaman, that's what you were talking about, the work that we've been doing over the last few years around transforming a system. What do we mean by community philanthropy? What is Shift the Power? And then a little bit, which is just really kind of reflections as they are in my head today, on what COVID-19 means in all of this. I feel like I've been in so many conversations around COVID-19 the last few weeks. I'm feeling a little bit overstimulated in that regard. Anyway, let me kick off. So, as Caroline said, we are a grant-making fund, and over the last 14 years have made grants to community philanthropy organizations in around 70 countries around the world. And I'll come to that in a little bit. But really, the context in which community philanthropy, these new forms of social organizations, community organizations, hybrid organizations are emerging, is happening against a backdrop of dramatic change away from the traditional kind of funding paradigm that we've been in. The localization agenda, which was agreed by big institutional donors back in 2016, was aimed at getting more money directly to organizations in the global south. Currently, 1% of international development aid gets directly to Southern civil society. And yet the system continually seems to find reasons why it can't send money directly to organizations in the global south. We're seeing crackdown on human rights, shrinking space issues in many parts of the world, and we're hearing that COVID-19 lockdowns are contributing to this in many parts of the world as well. We're seeing international NGOs repositioning, pivoting, if you like, to the global south. And what does that mean in terms of the configuration of different actors globally? You have the emergence of new philanthropy, China, Russia, new high net worth individuals creating foundations in countries like Egypt and Kenya and Uganda and Vietnam. And then you've got a kind of growing critique from the global south, which I think is really part of emergence of an increasingly loud voice of saying we need to change the system. And then just to add another couple of headlines in from here, but we're seeing the emergence of ordinary people giving. So this statistic, about 49% of Russians have donated in the last 12 months. There seems to be new ways in which people are starting to contribute and mobilize resources. And then ongoing concerns around social media and things like that and technology. So the big question that the Global Fund for Community Foundations has really been sort of wrestling with this is, can we reimagine the international development system? And by that, I suppose I also mean, can we really reimagine the global civil society system too? Because international development really as a function is shaped by the flows of money. But on the left, you see a picture of a sad looking house, which has been hit by some sudden shock. I'm not sure if that was a hurricane or what. But for many of us, and I think COVID-19 is highlighting this, a sudden shock to the system, to organizations that don't have strong roots or who perhaps live off project funding and live off what donors require. So they don't have strong roots into the ground. When a sudden shock happens, these organizations find themselves very vulnerable and in some instances collapsing. And certainly what we're hearing from partners around the world is that where some of our partners have international funding, they are not doing anything at the moment because they're terrified to be seen not to be spending the money that they have. And so we know that we have a systemic problem around civil society organizations that have been created to look like what they need to look like in order to access money. But perhaps what we should be thinking more is more of an ecosystem, the picture on the right-hand side of the screen. The idea of a rich forest floor of culture and history and assets in which all these sort of systems of giving and networks and relationships happen. And perhaps the institutions are those big trees that emerge out of that. Big trees that can stand, you know, the storms, the changes in the weather, if you like. So in a sense, this is the big picture. I'm a visual person. In my mind, as we're thinking around what's systemically wrong with the system we have at the moment. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about community philanthropy, as you'd asked, Karaman. So these are words, community philanthropy and community philanthropy. These are trigger words. So each of us will see something different in these. So I want to explain a little bit about how we've been using this language to create meaning rather than to confuse. So in our framing of community, we talk about community as geography, certainly, but also understanding that there are communities of identity and communities of issue, people who believe passionately. So the environmental movement, in a sense, is a community. Communities of identity, so we work with women's funds, for example. And that in many cases, geography is a clear pull in terms of what defines us. But as human beings, we can live in all of these types of communities. In a geography, an identity, an issue, they are kind of coexist alongside each other. We also know that communities, it sometimes gets romanticized, the notion of community, and that communities are dynamic spaces, they're contested spaces, they're not always harmonious. So I don't want to kind of over-romanticize the idea of community. But also, you know, one thing years of development aid has shown us, and of community resource mobilization, that when communities trust each other and are able to work together, they are much more effective at achieving their objectives. So external funding, for example, landing on a dysfunctional community will achieve much less than external funding landing on a trusting, healthy kind of community. And that communities are sources of knowledge, they're sources of resources, relationships, of trust, of informal leadership, formal leadership, lots of things that we can't see. And often the hard lens of international development has really failed to see these sort of hidden assets within a community. And also that has tended to see communities, particularly the most vulnerable, as beneficiaries rather than somehow experts in some element of their own, you know, the lived experience that they bring to the table. And so this idea that communities often do know the answers to the problem that's affecting it, or they can contribute to it, and that's an important piece of the puzzle. So in community, in this sense, is a kind of glue. It's the thing that moves us from being individuals to being a collective. And if we can be that collective, we can become quite a formidable force for change. And that very often these days we get pushed into our roles as individuals. It's all about me, me, me. And that really, how do we visit the gaps between us, the glue that connects us together? So that's community. This is philanthropy, also another word that triggers both equally positive and negative feelings. Is it the instrument of the elite, wealthy, unaccountable, non-tax-paying people, or is it really this kind of love of mankind, love of humankind? So a very kind of prosaic description of philanthropy might be private resources for public good, and those could be big resources or they could be small resources. Giving, gifting, the fact that people support each other, and often at a community level, even in the poorest communities, those kinds of lines of reciprocity and mutual self-help that exist. That this is a voluntary act, so taxation is a less voluntary act, but this is the idea that people can choose to participate. In a sense, you can, by giving, you choose to interact, to be a part of a community. So there's something important about the kind of collective act of giving. And that, you know, I'm here in South Africa where Ubuntu is a very clear framing idea. I am because you are, this notion of reciprocity. I am because you are, no one being too rich to give, no one being too poor, no one being too rich to receive, no one being too poor to give. And that there's an element of humans seeing each other. The act of giving is an act of humanity. But also I think there's more of a bit of a political framing of philanthropy that I want to suggest here. That it is a space, it's the non-tax paying space, but it is a space where people can come together and exercise, flex social muscle. So it's a space where you can participate, you can express solidarity, you can express empathy, you can also express dissent. And I think we're seeing in countries like Brazil, for example, at the moment, the importance of redefining community or participatory philanthropy as a space for people to be heard, I think is a really important piece of this. Equally, as a place for people to mobilize their resources to strengthen their ability to claim their rights from government. So I don't want to leave that piece off the definition. So what do we mean by community philanthropy at the Global Fund for Community Foundations? This is a bit of a long sentence, but it's as honed as we've managed to get it, which is community philanthropy is a form of and a force for. So it is a thing in itself and it leads to locally driven development. It strengthens community capacity and voice. It builds trust because of that collective action, and it taps into and builds on local resources which are pulled together and to build and sustain a strong community. So there's various things going on there, that it's about giving voice, that it's about strengthening the connections between people, that it acknowledges the importance of local resources. So even if external resources might come into a community, they need to build on what is already there. And that act of pooling actually is an act of strengthening community. Down in the right-hand side of the screen, you see some of the work of our partners in Zambia involved in the Zambian Governance Foundation, where this is a conversation around local philanthropy in a village, where the first early conversations are going on around what do we have that we can bring to the table, and if we can bring resources to the table, how does that change the position that we have? Does that make us much stronger? Community philanthropy, and if you're familiar at all with the community foundation model, you may know that there's one of the narratives around community foundations starts with this white, rather austere, white, elderly gentleman, Frederick Goff, who was one of the founders of the Cleveland Community Foundation, which is the oldest community foundation in the world, or the oldest organization that's self-identified as a community foundation. And when I say it's a supply side proposition, the problem that Frederick Goff set out to solve was that there were wealthy people in the community, and he saw their philanthropy was not efficient. And so the Community Foundation was a vehicle to bring together different philanthropic resources, largely from the elites, and channel them more effectively. That's the supply side proposition. It was the problem of organizing money. The supply side proposition is these wonderful women from Nepal who are associated with Nepal, with the TEWA, the Nepal Women's Fund, who, in the context of the activity of the women's funds of TEWA, they are both beneficiaries in that they work for small organizations, women's collectives and women's groups that receive grants from TEWA. But as individuals, they all also contribute back. It's not a loan, it's a voluntary gift. And this is deliberately built into the design of TEWA as a way to make sure these women are never just beneficiaries, they are also donors, and it's a way of flattening power. So I want to talk a little bit about a systems lens in our work, and I don't know how familiar you all are with systems thinking. It's a journey I myself have been on over the last few years, and it's been a very interesting journey. But I want to share two visuals with you, which I found really helpful in thinking about systems change. One is this idea of 45-degree change, and there's a really fantastic paper which applies to 45-degree change as a metaphor for rethinking a context in the UK, but I think it's applicable in many environments too. And it is that notion that you have sort of top down and bottom up. You've got on your left-hand side, you've got formal institutions, governments, structures, laws, parliaments, corporations. And in our conversation, I would say you have formal international development and a big philanthropy on that vertical side. And then on the horizontal side, you've got civil society. So really at the bottom of that, that's just people coming together in whatever ways they do. And as you go further towards that 45-degree line, this is civil society getting more organized. So you've got your unions, your NGOs, your social enterprises. And the sort of logic of 45-degree change is that if you want to change a system, you can't do it from only one of those sides. You need to work from both of those sides, both of them moving towards that 45-degree line down the middle. So you need action from top down, and you need push from the bottom up. And in a context like international development, it feels sometimes there's been a bit of a disconnect between the formal system saying we want to do things differently and an emergent system saying we want change. So the 45-degree proposition is actually, how do you start brokering conversations that cross either side of those lines? So how can top down see bottom up? How can bottom up see and interact with top down? And then the image on the right comes from a paper. Also, there's a fabulous paper associated with it called Systems to Shift the Power. And these dots and clusters on the left-hand side, you've got a centralized network. So that's the French train system. So all trains in France go through Paris, for better or worse. And that is governments can be highly centralized. And that may be an efficient system for acting quickly to getting things from the center to the periphery, but perhaps it's not so good for dealing with more complex issues. The middle issue is one of a distributed network where you've still got some power devolved, but there are still hubs and nodes. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the devolved the decentralized networks in the middle, sorry, and this is the distributed networks, distributed power on the right-hand side, where power, a bit like the internet, I suppose, or blockchain, sits in different places. And this is the kind of mutual connectivity between parts of the system that pulls things together. And as we've been looking at the emerging community philanthropy space, we've been looking at this sort of distributed model of how do you see change at the edges, but in a way that joins up and aggregates to be sort of systemic change, if you like. I can send you the links to these papers afterwards, but these are just some of the ideas that we're playing with. So in recent years, we have been organizing increasingly under this hashtag Shift the Power. And the short version of Shift the Power is the image on the right, which is there's a river with tributaries leading into it. And some of those tributaries, so if river is a shifting, how we shift the power so that those on the edges, those in communities, those closest to issues have greater agency. There are all these interesting lines of work in this regard: the emergence of hybrid organizations, the emergence of participatory grant making, participatory budgeting through governments. There are all these things going on at the moment, but they're not often speaking to each other. And so can we start thinking of ways where we can actually get these paths, these different tributaries of the river, to start leading into a big, substantial conversation? So in recent years, we've started to convene around this Shift the Power agenda. In 2016, we held the first global summit on community philanthropy in South Africa. And we had about 400 people from 60 plus countries, mainly from the global South, coming together, really representing the emergence of the thing that was new. These were small funds and foundations that were mobilizing local community philanthropy, that were using grants not as a way just to channel money, but to really devolve power and resources to people to do things for themselves. And what was clear is that there are pressures within the existing international development. There are pressures in the system where centralized power has failed to reach people at the edges. And I think the election of Trump, Brexit, the rise of populism, these could all be seen of the acts of people at the edges feeling like they've not been heard and wanting to punish a system. So somehow our organizational forms have not been good at interacting at the edges. In fact, they've probably become rather good at centralizing their own power. And so starting to think around the system we want, maybe that's based on relational power, the ability to be known and connected and trusted, rather than on financial power, how much you have in your budgets. And that maybe that there are blockages in the system. So for example, I've been in touch with an international NGO based in Europe recently, wanting to understand what community philanthropy is. What's community philanthropy? What's participatory grant making? These parts of a development system are entirely siloed. People don't talk to each other. We all live in our little bubbles, whether it's gender or environment or humanitarian aid or development, or we're all specialists. And maybe what we need is a bit more of a cross weave. So back in November, we held a second convening in London, Pathways to Power, where we brought 100 people together from across that system, that 45-degree change visual, if you like, to start saying, actually, how can we start to weave these conversations across the system? So I'm just going to come the last few slides before we kind of get to COVID, and then I have really just a very few things to kind of kick off a conversation in that regard. So what we started to do in London was to look at the quality of relationships and the number of relationships of the people, the 100 people in that room who came from funds and foundations working in remote parts of India or of Zambia, wherever it was on the edges, or even community groups in the UK, and people who are located in large structures in the global north and in the global south. And these dots, instead of me telling you how many people I know, I tell you how many people I know and I go to for particular, rather than saying how many people know me, I tell you how many people I know. Who do I go to for advice on certain things? And we divided up a list of critical things that we thought needed to be solved if we wanted to shift the power. So reimagining what international NGOs look like, reimagining what global civil society looked like, rethinking what kinds of metrics and measurements and evidence we needed, rethinking what the kind of narrative we would need to tell this story of a more bottom-up, devolved, distributed story. And so these networks show the number and quality of relationships, quantity of relationships between those 100 people in a room. And you start to see that there are some hubs where people go to. What's interesting about this is it's a global cohort. What's also interesting is that the top 15 organizations own a third of all the relationships. So there are 15 organizations that hold quite a lot of power, and 10 of those 15 organizations are international organizations. So we have a design problem already in that too much of the connection is happening internationally. We're not going into kind of more national or regional conversations to find the sources of knowledge and expertise. We're actually meeting at the level of international. And this is just to give you a quick example. One of the pathways that we looked at, so the question would be, who do you go to talk about localization or strengthening local leadership? And if you look in the top part of that, the slide, you see those connections where you can see there are a few clear hubs in the system. When you strip out international actors and look only at organizations that describe themselves as local or national actors, you see that we have a very weak system there. There aren't many people talking to each other. If they're talking to anyone, they're talking to international actors. So this is just it's a good sort of metaphor to show you actually, sometimes we kid ourselves that there's more out there than there is. And sometimes there are things out there, but they are simply not joined up with each other. And so could we start understanding shifting power as a way of starting to be much more intentional about building relationships in ways that didn't aggregate power and connections, but rather than devolved it? And a classic way that an organization builds power is if it's a grant maker, because I make grants to lots of organizations, they have a relationship with me. What am I doing to create the relationships between them? And sometimes this is not intentionally done, it sort of happens by the by, but these are the structures that you end up with. Okay, let me see my. So I'm just going to say a word about COVID-19, because I think in a sense what I've been telling you all along is part of the story of the conversation that we need to have if we want to start thinking about the system we want. And the framing that we have used, in fact, we've really moved away from the framing of international development, because it really starts only talking about particular flows of money from the global north to the global south by and large. And it actually limits the number of actors one can engage to and talk to, because if you're sitting in the US, international development doesn't mean anything to you. So the idea of a good society where you have radical civil society, a responsive state, and a socially responsible corporate sector, this surely is something that binds us all together. Can we have a sort of defining narrative that joins people up wherever they are in the system? And I think COVID-19 and the way that it is rolled out and affected parts of Europe and the United States, and really come as a massive shock to those systems and structures, really shows that actually this is sort of shown that we are all in this together. It's subverted some of the normal expectations of how things like pandemics or disasters roll out, which tends to start in the global south. And what we're seeing play out, say, in countries like the UK, is massive outpouring of solidarity and mutuality at the edges, and we're seeing that happen everywhere, actually. We've done consultations with our partners around the world, and this seems to be one thing, is that people are organizing. While parts of civil society have sort of stopped, people are organizing. And in some instances, you hear stories of NGOs actually stopping their formal programs, pooling their own money just to get stuff done. So we're seeing this kind of collision of the sort of the structures that are not able to respond and the ability for response to happen quickly and ably. I think we're seeing people concerned about what it means to have lockdowns in terms of freedom of movement and freedom of expression, and multiple kinds of human rights type freedoms. I think in the global south, in many countries, the issue right now is not the virus, the pandemic itself, it's the effects of lockdown. it's sort of hunger rather than disease, and this sort of axis between, you know, which do you choose? Is it a privilege to be able to be locked down and quarantined? I mean, what about people who've got nowhere to be locked down? So you're seeing this massive inequality, stigmatization of certain groups, people feeling that the illness itself is a stigma. So you're seeing all of these things happening. And in the community philanthropy space, I think what's really interesting, again, we're seeing pluses and minuses. Governments coming to community foundations, community philanthropy organizations, precisely because they are known in the community, they have relationships, they are trusted, and governments going, we don't know what it is we need to do. In other places, governments completely ignoring civil society. In some places, local businesses coming to community foundations saying, we used to give to you, if you want us to be here on the other side, can you help us now? So we're seeing all sorts of disruptions. And through our work, we're trying to support some of our partners who are dealing with this immediate response, and just in terms of having communities coming to them going, help us now. So people stepping into humanitarian aid modes when they've never done this before. At the same time, you're seeing international NGOs, many have sent their international staff home. Will they come back? What does this mean longer term? And some of the larger trends sort of systemically are, you know, I think things that we're all worried about is, after this, nothing will look the same, but will we lose gains that have been made, or can we start to think about building back better? And if we want to start thinking about that, now is the time to be doing it. So how can we join up across these different conversations with that idea? You know, there was a survey that was done in the UK a few weeks ago where I think 9% of people surveyed said they wanted to things to go back as they had been previously, because they were living slightly differently. So how can we take that positive element of people not wanting to go back to how it was before, and start to kind of really feed the imagination, use the moments, you know, you've got government starting to pay a universal basic income. Can we use technology better to sort of organize more forms of new power, civic engagement, interaction? Can that help us think about the institutions that we need rather than the institutions that we have? But at the same time, I think there are deep fears that on the other side of this, many of our systems and structures will be considerably weaker. So I think one of the spaces that we are really concerned about now is both supporting partners in the immediate, but also understanding what does it mean when you've got locally trusted organizations that people are going to? How can we make sure that doesn't get lost in the story here? There is a reason people are going to local organizations and who are doing things, and it's to do with trust and relationships. So how can we weave in those multiple hyper-local actions into a conversation about the system we want, so that we're building it from the bottom up and not from the top down? And this is a quote from my colleague, Neil Lawson, who's with an organization called Compass in the UK, around Build Back Better, that a good society could never be imposed, only negotiated. And I'd say, I think my increasing sense is that we need to start negotiating those things sooner rather than later. Karaman, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much for the great presentation. That's actually an eye-opener to lots of things, and I guess the audience have lots of questions. But before we open up the floor for the audience, I just want to ask you something. You know, communities do have different social fabrics. Some communities have strong social fabrics, and others, by design, they do have weaker social fabrics. And I give you an example. For example, in the first session of the webinar, we hosted Mr. Hashim Dandarawi. He is the president of the Dandara Cultural Center. It's a community organization in Upper Egypt. They do have a strong social fabric that they already are building on. So they are doing amazing work. They are managing to get things together, and God bless them. They know how things go. But on the other hand, we are working on a research project with other partners who are trying to help people in informal settlement or slum area to get together and find their own community institution that govern their own affairs. However, there is no sense of community, there is no social fabric. It's very weak and you cannot blame them. Most of them are people who are displaced and they are facing very harsh economic conditions. So my question is, do you think that given the COVID-19, those people are trying to survive? Okay, so if an external intervention attempt to get these people together, will that be feasible, or any external intervention at that time will do harm more than good? That's my first question. Another question is actually based on your experience and from a global perspective, do you think there are some institutional gaps that would appear? And how can we fill those gaps to promote community philanthropy?
Okay, those are good, difficult questions. So on your first one, I think you're right. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. People who are trying to survive are probably, you know, it's going to be a handful of people, or the minority, who are also up for thinking about the future. I think that's just a given. So my experience has been that there has to be, you know, where there is local kind of leadership, and even if it's not leadership about a concrete thing, but a sense of opportunity, and that person can be followed and can build support. I think that's a starting point. I don't think this can be imposed from outside. I think the more, you know, one of the problematic things with community philanthropy for the international development system is it really can't be introduced from outside. It has to meet leadership on the ground, which wants it. The demand side needs to be there. However, having said that, so maybe sort of extreme examples where people are really suffering and it really is a question of kind of where's my next meal coming from, maybe that's not the time. However, if there's time or headspace to provide those who are interested, it's often the examples of other people who are a bit like themselves, rather than an outsider coming in, that actually starts to build those seeds of what might be different. And I think that's what we've seen more and more in our network. It's the hearing from peers, other people like me, saying something, but just being a bit further along in the journey. So there's something really important about creating the conditions where people can kind of be opened up to those sorts of ideas when they are ready. But I think without that, it's a sort of, there's no point in going in and going, oh, in the meantime, let's kind of reimagine what institution you might want here. But having said that, I do think we've seen where there have been shocks to the system, and I think the Arab Spring was probably one example. After the earthquake in Nepal was another. People do extraordinary things when they need to, so they get organized, and you know, for the time that they're needed, they are there. But then as soon as that shock is over, they tend to disperse. So in a sense, the question is, how can we start thinking about places where some of that knowledge, that memory, that flex be kept alive? And that almost being the flame that actually can build a fire longer term. Because I think there was an expectation, certainly in Egypt, from conversations I had then, was that some of these things naturally would just turn into community foundations. Well, they don't, because most people aren't out to build institutions. You have to create the logic for that to become the thing you want. So I think there's, you know, it's a balancing act here. It really is a kind of acupuncture of knowing when to use the right needles for the right things. And in terms of the institutional gaps, I think some of the main gaps are ones that we have kind of created for ourselves, in thinking that as institutions, organizations need to be entirely focused on a particular thing. So we've become so siloed in civil society. So you've got groups, you know, right now, I'm sure there are COVID response, there are NGOs that are dealing with COVID right now saying, but hang on, our mission is to do this. We're not allowed to do that. And so somehow there has to be a kind of mental liberation happen here. And I think it is, part of it relates to the sort of, you know, decolonization sort of agenda, which is actually, you know, who says just because you're good at that, you can't be good at something else? And, you know, while we may need specializations within civil society, what probably is as important is organizations that can weave across all of those things. And I think those gaps, the gaps of organizations that can mediate between external and local, between this community and that community, between this issue and that issue, and bring that larger view. I think that is a real systemic design flaw we have in the system. So then we wonder why we can't solve complex problems, because we're coming at it with single approaches each time, and often with short-term funds that assume that you can buy the result in 3 years, rather than it being a complicated problem which may take considerably longer.
Nice. Thank you so much, Jenny. Luciana, do we have questions from the audience?
Can you hear me like that?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny, for the presentation. It was amazing and very informative. We have one question till now. From your experience, are community foundations vulnerable to corruption, especially more than corporate foundations?
So that's a good question. So the logic of a good community foundation or a good community philanthropy is that it is able to, when local people give, that should keep you accountable. So in the international development system, I think when your donors are on the other side of the world, there's a certain freedom that might give you to kind of just know that your donor's not going to turn up on your doorstep the next day. I think nothing will keep you more accountable than having people in your community give. And sometimes them realizing their power and being able to come in and say, what happened to my money? That building in that kind of co-ownership, I think, is a way of building accountability into a structure. One of our partners in India does something which they do a kind of radical auditing, where they, once a year, they open up their books and they invite all their grant partners and their donors to come in and say, go through anything you want, just show us. So I think there's that multi-stakeholder view, which it suggests that everyone who is cooperating and coming together within the community foundation needs to trust each other. And without that trust, you can't build anything. So I think it's an essential piece. If you are to grow, then you need to be trusted. So therefore, you need to be transparent. You need to show different stakeholders, whether they're local or external, exactly where their money went. And in a sense, that's what I was saying about then the purpose of community philanthropy is less about the money and more about building those relationships within the constituency of the community foundation, if you like.
Thank you, Jen. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Okay, before we wrap up, I will ask you one final question. See, in the light of what's happening, we see mixed signals. Sometimes we feel that the COVID-19 situation is compelling people to resort to more centralized approaches to contain the mess. And at the same time, we see people amazingly coming together, showing solidarity and making things work in more decentralized manner. So I know nobody has an answer, but I just want to know your insights about the future, especially in our region. Are we heading towards more bottom-up model of doing things, or will the top-bottom approach come back even more aggressively?
That is a conversation that I've had almost every day since this all started. I was speaking to someone this morning exactly about that. Is power going to become more centralized as a result of this? And this was not just in your region, but in other parts of the world too. I think we're stepping onto very fragile ice, and we're tiptoeing, not knowing where the holes are. And I think it could go either way. For every person I speak to who feels optimistic about things being better on the other side, there are others who feel very worried about where things are going. And I think that makes it more important than ever for those who want things to get better actually to organize. It won't get better unless there is organizing and joining up, because the forces we're talking about, centralized power as that map of the French railway system, is a blunt and effective instrument for dealing very simply with complex issues. And it's easy to mobilize. That distributed power relies on trust and connections and a willingness to do business with each other. So there's a responsibility here if we want to distribute power within a system and be more networked, more kind of new power, then that's not going to happen unless those of us who want it sort of step forward and are ready to play a role in that. So I think there is there is an opportunity, but I think there are deep threats. And I would tell you that in my own experience, it depends on the time of the day how I would answer that question. I tend to go up like this. But I think believing, that there's an opportunity for us to come out the other side in a world we want. If we believe in it, then we need to start designing it, thinking about it, and joining up.
Okay, some other questions from the audience. Someone is asking, in a country like Egypt that is characterized by more centralized institutions and risk-averse poor neighborhoods, what would you advise us to start from?
Say the last bit again. In a
country like Egypt that is characterized by more centralized institution by design over history and risk-averse poor neighborhoods. Just if you ask you to tell us just where to start, one advice to start from.
I think there's something to do with, I think it's worth working from the top down and from the bottom up. I mean, being very strategic and very tactical. I think only building from the bottom up, you still hit the same problems. So there's I think approaching from both ends is really important. Some of the most sort of powerful work that we've supported in starting these conversations has literally been to do sort of surveys or research on who gives what, how, why, and where in a particular community. So you start actually seeing what's already there. So you start socializing that conversation within a community and start changing how people think. But you also start translating that into a language that perhaps more centralized power understands. Governments always have a limited ability to act quickly and responsive and nimbly, and they're not always there in the community. So starting to sort of show how that actually can make bigger systems more effective, but also actually activate communities to be seen in that picture, I think is really important too. So I think it is a kind of, and it depends on the environment and the circumstances and the opportunity, but really kind of working from both ends with a view to hoping that they somehow kind of start to converge, I think is one sort of effective way of thinking about this.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Actually, that's the start of a conversation. You beautifully complemented the community development dialogue that the series started. And we hope we managed to trigger the curiosity of the audience to reflect and think deeper into constructive ways and models to build back better. Thank you so much, Jenny. It's really a pleasure. I enjoyed our discussion big time, and I'm sure the audience benefited a lot from you. Thanks a lot. And you owe us a visit to Cairo when the mess is over.
Yeah, okay. Thanks so much, Karaman. Thanks, everybody. You have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you to each and every one of the audience. And just a gentle reminder that next week we're going to have two great speakers in the house. On Tuesday, we are hosting Anil Gupta from the Honeybee Network. He will talk about leveraging the entrepreneurial potential of financially poor but knowledge-rich grassroots innovators. And on Wednesday, we are hosting the father of the bottom of the pyramid approach to heart, and he's going to talk about a new age of sustainable capitalism. So please, you will find the registration, link to the registration in our social media platforms. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed the discussion, and see you next Tuesday. Thank you, Jenny.